So let's get started, everybody. Thank you very much for attending this seminar. Welcome to the Interface Seminar Series. I am Vahid Aryadoust from the National Institute of Education at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I'm the host of the Interface, which was launched during the global pandemic, as you know, to provide dynamic platforms for the exploration of pioneering research across language and diverse scientific disciplines. Today, I'm very pleased to host the third seminar by Professor Chong Plonsky, who is a professor of applied linguistics at North Arizona University. And as you know him very well, he has been in the field for quite a few years now, and he has made significant contributions to the field of second language acquisition and meta-analyses. So without any further ado, I would like to pass the time to Luke. His talk will be about 45 minutes-ish, and then I'll ask questions from him. Thank you so much. Over to you, Luke.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vahid, and thanks also to Lynette for the invitation, for all the organization and coordination involved in setting this up, and for this chance to kind of think about and reflect on where we are with meta-analysis and where we're headed in the field. It's kind of a fun task for me to think about, and it's been fun to prepare these slides here. So I'm going to jump right in, and I have this sort of meme here: keep calm and love meta-analysis. And I actually do love meta-analysis. It's not an exaggeration to say that meta-analysis did actually kind of change my life. It changed so much of my thinking as a researcher, not only a secondary researcher, but also a primary researcher. It's changed the way I think about all types of research in terms of conceptualization to design, to instrumentation, to analysis, to interpretation at the primary level, at the secondary level, and really everything that I do as a scholar, teacher, trainer, et cetera. So with that, I'm going to jump in here. It is not an exaggeration. I think it's certainly true to say that meta-research is here. Meta-research is an integral now part of our discipline, and I'm going to talk mostly from the perspective of second language acquisition and applied linguistics, but throughout the language sciences, meta-analysis has arrived. Each of these, this is just a graph representing the frequency of different types of different meta papers in the field since the introduction really in the late 90s and early 2000s. So you see in recent years, just a kind of explosion of meta-research happening. And I maintain on my website here, that's a bibliography of meta-research, covering virtually all different areas of the field, as well as a number of different methodological topics, which we'll talk about here in a second. Further evidence of the sort of arrival of meta-research in the field is the fact that we have special issues dedicated to meta-analysis and other meta topics. We've got article designations and article types in different journals. I'm told recently that there's a new journal coming out soon on research synthesis and meta-analysis. We've had lots and lots of workshops at conferences on meta-research. There are at least 2 universities that I know of that regularly teach semester-long courses on meta-analysis. There's a research synthesis in applied linguistics special interest group in the British Association for Applied Linguistics. And there's been one book published so far. I know of 2 or 3 others that are in preparation, trying to inform and equip the field to carry out meta or secondary and systematic synthetic research. So it's here. And there are many, many types of synthetic research. This is Sin-Wang, Chong, and I put together a few years ago a kind of a typology of secondary research in applied linguistics. But just to situate it a little bit here, we're within the realm, if anybody's coming to this who's not familiar with secondary or synthetic research, it's a type in meta-analysis, it's a type of literature review, you could call it. And then, so under lit reviews, we have systematic research, and then there's both qualitative and quantitative. We're mostly, in this discussion, going to be living here in the quantitative realm. Probably not a big surprise for a lot of you here. Sin-Wang, Chong, and I also put together kind of within this taxonomy, we described a number of different features that correspond to different types of secondary and synthetic research. We're not going to go through this in depth because today we're mostly going to be talking about meta-analysis. So what's the big deal? Why meta-analysis? Why do people make a big deal about this? Why has it exploded in the field? As far as I see it, there are probably three main reasons why meta-analysis has become so popular in our field and in others. And the first, and maybe the most important, is that it can give us very high validity evidence. Meta-analysis forces us to move beyond the idea that any single study could provide a conclusive answer to any question worth asking, which it can't. No single study can do that. Meta-analysis embraces an empirical approach to reviewing an existing body of research. And what I mean by empirical, I mean it's more systematic, it's more objective, and it's more transparent. By systematicity, what I mean is that we're comprehensively, exhaustively searching for all the primary studies that meet our particular inclusion criteria. We're looking for a sample of studies that actually approximates, if not equals, the population of primary studies. By objectivity, I want to hedge around that a little bit because there's no such thing as pure objectivity, but we're trying to set up clear definitions, operational definitions of variables and the items in the primary studies that we're coding for in order to remove a little bit of the researcher subjectivity. And then transparency is where we, just like a primary study, we're going to disclose all the methods and procedures that led us to arrive at our final meta-analytic outcome. And when we do that, we allow readers, other researchers, practitioners, whoever it might be, to evaluate our methods and to understand any potential threats to the validity of those findings. Meta-analysis allows us to get closer to understanding the signal and to move beyond, to understand some of the random variation that might exist in a particular sample of primary studies, and to actually measure that and estimate the signal versus the noise in our sample of primary studies. And because of these reasons, I think that meta-analysis is better for informing theory and practice. Another reason why I think meta-analysis is so great is that I actually think of it as an efficiency tool. And what do I mean by an efficiency tool? Well, I think we would all recognize and agree that it's not hard, it's impossible to stay current in our field. Even if I say, okay, I'm just an SLA person, I only care about reading second language acquisition research, it's impossible to keep up. There might be, let me say, 40 journals, and there's probably many more than that regularly publish SLA research. And if they each publish 4 issues per year, and there's 8 articles per issue, and I spend 2 hours reading each one, that's 2,500 articles per year, and I simply can't do that. Even if we only look at one single individual domain, you can see these are just Google Scholar searches for different domains within the field. So this one here, incidental vocabulary learning from watching TV, 27,000 hits. Inductive versus deductive grammar teaching, 17,000 hits. Accuracy and collaborative versus individual L2 writing, 86,000 hits. It's impossible to stay current. What meta-analysis does is it gives us it gives us a sort of an aggregation of the effects and the relationships that we care about. So, and just to illustrate that a little bit further here, this might be, oh my gosh, we could look at all these studies and say, oh, how are we going to make sense of all this? And so what we do is, in a meta-analysis, is take all these results and try to standardize them in a way, and then convert the effects that are present in those primary studies and all these different tables and figures in the data. We put them on a common metric. In this case, we're looking at a d-value, which is a standardized mean difference. And then we can take those d-values once they're on a common standardized metric to compare, contrast, combine, or aggregate effects across a study. So let's see what that looks like. This is one figure from a meta-analysis comparing the accuracy and L2 writing between individual writers and collaborative writers. So the middle triangle here for this study shows that the collaborative writers' accuracy was 2 standard deviations from this particular group higher than the individual writer's accuracy than that group. Okay, but this study right here, this is just one study. If we were to look at that, we wouldn't know the full range of effects in this particular domain. So that's what we get by looking at the meta-analytic level. Looking across these studies, we can see the overall meta-analytic effect, or the overall meta-analytic difference between collaborative writers and individual writers is closer to a standardized mean difference of about 1. Just to illustrate this again, just to show a couple of examples. In this meta-analysis, we were looking at the the criterion-related validity of elicited imitation tasks. And if you're not familiar with that, it's not so important. It's just a kind of a shortcut proficiency assessment. And we looked at the meta-analytic correlation between each of these elicited imitation tasks and other measures of proficiency. We found, you can see this overall meta-analytic correlation of 0.67. Okay, and I'll just add to this, to the efficiency argument. So as a way to look across the body of studies very quickly and efficiently, I also think that when we behave more efficiently on an individual level and on a field-wide level, we're also behaving more ethically. To me, any sort of waste of time is actually unethical because we're detracting from what we might be able to contribute to the field when we're not behaving efficiently. And then third is that meta-analysis allows us to, when we look at the substantive findings, the substantive gaps in the literature, as well as the methodological features, practices, and perhaps shortcomings in a particular sample or subdomain of the field, it allows us to make empirically grounded recommendations for future research. So when the meta-analytic discussion section talks about what research is still needed, it's not just because I think it's needed, or I feel like it's needed, or I think it's important. It's because the data that I've coded from the sample of studies shows that there's a gap in the literature, and that's a more powerful argument. So it's not surprising that meta-research in applied linguistics is here, that it's kind of exploded over time. We're not alone. This is the same, applied linguistics, language sciences have really followed in other disciplines. We can see here ecology and economics and medicine, similar trajectories of meta-analytic growth over the decades. It's also the case that meta-analyses tend to have higher impact. And there's lots of different ways of measuring impact. I'm not here to suggest that the only important measure of impact is citations, but that's one way that we do measure impact. And this study found that in the health sciences, found that meta-analyses tend to have more citations than all these other types of studies, than randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, case studies, etc. By the way, I'll just mention, I think this would be a really cool study to replicate in the language sciences. If anybody wants to do that, just let me know. We also see the same impact happening in the language sciences, and these aren't the most highly cited meta-analyses, but this is a handful of meta-analyses in our field, and you can see by this is the publication date on the right, and then the number of citations according to Google Scholar for each of these meta-analyses, and you can see that the meta-analyses do often tend to be cited frequently. So they probably, I think it's safe to say that they are fairly high impact, this type of research, or it can be. Have they taught us anything though? Do we know more about language usage, language learning, language teaching, language assessment, language policy, curriculum, all these things that a lot of us care about thanks to meta-analyses? I would say yes. Yes, definitely. We know a lot. And this talk isn't really about the substantive findings of meta-analysis, but I would encourage you to dive into it. And for anybody who isn't familiar with reading meta-analyses, I would especially encourage you to dive into the moderator analyses, where you start to understand some of the systematic variability across primary literature. The overall meta-analytic outcome is very exciting, that overall d-value, that overall correlation coefficient, but I encourage you to go 1 or 2 steps deeper and to look at the moderator analyses. To me, that's the most interesting stuff. But so these are just examples of meta-analyses in the field that show overall outcomes across, in this case, across grammar instruction, vocab instruction, pragmatics instruction, pronunciation instruction. And here we see each of these addresses the question of the meta-analytic correlation between an individual difference variable like motivation or anxiety and second language achievement. So we do have real substantive findings in the field that we have thanks to meta-analysis. And in case anybody's curious, the median correlation between individual difference variables and L2 achievement is about 0.26. Okay, even though we have all these great findings, methodologically speaking, I think we still have a ways to go. There's been a few recent reviews of synthetic practices in the language sciences. Chalmers et al. 2023. Woman Yuhang Hu, who I've been working with now for a number of years, just recently defended her dissertation study, which was a methodological synthesis and quality assessment of L2 meta-analyses. And Vogan and Lee recently also assessed meta-analytic quality in L2 research. And overall, I'm not going to go through a lot of detail of those studies, but overall, they found very mixed quality. They found in many of the different practices within the meta-analytic methods, a lack of rigor as well as a lack of transparency. Because this is concerning, especially if we think about the relatively high impact that those studies tend to be. I'm concerned that there are problems in them, and as people, we as a field are going to use meta-analyses as a way to inform theory and practice, then they have to be high validity. We have to try to eliminate as many of those threats to validity of the meta-analytic outcomes as we can. So in the spirit of trying to move the field forward, we've come really far, I think, in terms of applying meta-analytic techniques over the last 25 years. But there's a number of different things that are practices, techniques, methods that we're doing maybe a little bit of, and that maybe we could do more of to sort of catapult our science a little bit further. And I've sort of categorized those different practices or techniques into 3 areas: meta-analytic design and methods, meta-analytic data analysis, and then I want to talk about briefly some additional types of synthetic research that have come out and that have sort of been introduced and begun to be used in the field. And collectively, I'm sort of calling this meta-analysis 2.0, sort of looking at maybe the first phase of meta-analysis of the last 20 or 25 years, and now we're sort of moving ahead to greater sophistication and hopefully more useful overall findings. So we'll first start talking about design and methods. And there's 4 different design or methodological issues, broadly speaking, in meta-analytic methods that I'll mention, and I'll go through these. And by the way, there's more here than in each of these I'm just going to kind of touch on a little bit. And the references in all of them, if anybody wants any of the references, I'm happy to share them as well. Many of them are on my website, on the bibliography that I maintain for meta-analytic and secondary or synthetic research. But we're just going to touch on each of them, and all of them are worth exploring really in depth. But I'm just going to kind of touch on all of them in a kind of a light way to cover a lot of territory. So the first one is AI augmented or machine learning augmented filtering of primary studies. In the same way that the sorting hat might tell kids who arrive at Hogwarts, so where they go. As the meta-analyst, what we need to do is we need to figure out which studies that we look at, primary studies, belong or don't belong in our samples. And when we do a meta-analysis, it's super important. One of the most important things is to conduct comprehensive searches of primary literature. We want to sacrifice redundancy for the sake of having a comprehensive and ideally exhaustive search of the primary literature. But this is obviously very time-consuming and very error-prone. This figure on the right here shows the number of citations that we might find in an initial search plotted against the total number of hours that it takes to go through all those citations to figure out which studies belong in my sample versus which ones that do not. I remember I've been involved in a number of synthetic projects. I remember one of them, we had an RA, very thankfully, that was doing the searching for us. And I think she spent 150 hours just doing the search. And that's not uncommon. Okay, so we might obviously then ask ourselves, well, is there a quicker way we can do this? Yeah, and as linguists especially, I think it makes sense for us to think, well, primary articles are text. So what are some ways that maybe we could make this process more efficient? And fortunately, there are actually some really useful off-the-shelf tools that will do this. And the basic process, I'm not going to go through this in depth, but the basic process is that we create, as you might expect, with other types of machine learning-based or AI-based types of procedures, we're going to develop like a training set of studies. So imagine you do a search and there's 5,000 hits that might meet your inclusion criteria for your meta-analytic sample. Well, you're going to find, let's say, 100 or 200 that you think for sure do match your inclusion criteria, and use that as a training set to then go through the rest of the sample and then you sort of check it along the way to figure out which ones match or don't. So the training set sorts the candidate studies, and then you would check for recall along the way. And I want to recommend that you check out this paper by Quan et al., which is just out recently in Research Methods in Applied Linguistics, which details some of the software. But there are a number of different programs that will do this. Another step in the meta-analytic process, which is also very slow and error-prone, is the coding process. So if anybody's not familiar, what we do in a meta-analysis is we take all the primary studies, and this image up here, this is an entire coding scheme for a meta-analysis that I was involved in a number of years ago. Each row is a study, and each column is a different study feature related to the sample or treatment or the instrumentation, as well as eventually the actual effect sizes, the outcomes that we're coding for. And when we look at sometimes definitely dozens and sometimes hundreds of primary studies, and we code them for all these features, it can also be sort of error prone and most especially very, very slow. And so what we might consider doing, and some people have started to do this in a couple of different ways, is to think about maybe applying what we might call kind of corpus-based approaches. So a lot of folks, I don't know if anybody here is into corpus linguistics, but corpus folks will take bodies of text and extract linguistic patterns. And we can do a similar thing when we try to conduct a meta-analysis. So I can think of at least 3 possible uses of this sort of corpus-based approach to data extraction in a meta-analytic situation. First, we might try to extract study features or potential moderators like proficiency level or L1 or setting, things like that from a meta-analytic sample. We might also want to code for, we often do want to code for meta-analytic practices. We could do some of these, we probably could do using kind of corpus-based approaches. And then we could even in some cases perhaps code or extract effect sizes or other statistics from a meta-analytic sample. And I'll show you guys what that looks like in a second. For the first one, imagine we wanted to code for the first languages or the target languages or the educational levels in a very large sample of primary studies. Well, the traditional way of doing that would be to go study by study and with our Excel spreadsheet open and article by article through the PDFs, and we would find the method section, find the participant section, and then we would find where it says what the ones are, the target languages, educational levels of the participants in each primary study, things like that. Could that be done by writing simple scripts like in Python or using AntConc, which is a off-the-shelf free corpus tool? Sure, yeah. Some of that could be done. Now, so this is an example of, based on a corpus that I maintain of second language research. This is the instances of different language words, and the list goes on much further than this, as well as different sort of keywords associated with different educational levels. Now, we could attach, this is just looking across the whole entire sample of thousands of articles in this corpus that I maintain. But if we were to sort of take an approach which I characterize as, or I call meta-sample as corpus, that we could also link very easily these different lexical items to the studies that they correspond to, the studies in which they occur. Now, might there be error in that? Certainly. Just because the word Japanese appears in a particular article doesn't mean that that was the L1 or the target language or anything like that. So there'd be some additional steps that would be required, but that would be one way of maybe getting a quick gauge of the presence of different L1s or target language in a particular sample. We could take it one step further and code, annotate within the text files of the meta-analytic sample to then say, if we annotated each of the text, convert the PDF files to TXT files to make them easier to process using corpus tools, and we could annotate the text file, the TXT files, for the different sections of the manuscript, and that would give us a better estimate or a clearer view of some of these different methodological techniques that we're interested in. Let's say we were interested in quantifying or assessing or measuring the extent of different methodological practices. So one here that's that I care a lot about, and a lot of us who are concerned about instrumentation and measurement in SLA, for example, are worried about the lack of validity evidence. When I talk to my friends who work in language assessment, and we talk about, the quality of the assessments and tools in SLA literature, the way that we measure knowledge or proficiency or explicit knowledge, things like this, it's really problematic. Cohen and Macro said 10 years ago or so, there's perhaps an unwritten agreement that readers will accept measures used in an SLA study at face value without asking about the reliability and validity for the task at hand. Is that true? Do you think that's true? Do we just sort of say, everything, pay no attention, everything's fine, just assume I have a strong validity argument behind this little instrument I put together over the weekend, right? Well, let's find out. So one thing that we could do, and that I've tried out, is let's find out to what extent applied linguists have expressed explicit verbal or written interest in validity. That would be one way to start to get at that question. And so what I did was, again, taking the same corpus of mine. It's a corpus of about 20. It's a little bigger now, but when I did this, it had 22 journals, about 22,000 articles, and about 150 million words. And I searched for instances of different facets of validity plus validity. So predictive validity, discriminative validity, et cetera, et cetera. And how often do we think that these occurred? And I'm sort of using this as a proxy for applied linguists or L2 researchers' explicit interest or concern for validity in their measures, in their studies. How often? Well, it turns out this is probably not a big surprise. Not very often. We don't generally talk about, I should specify this, I did not include language assessment quarterly or language testing when I ran this analysis, because I know that those journals, because they're focused on language assessment, we're talking about validity more often. But only 2 in 100 articles mentions or says the words construct validity. Only 1 in every 1,000 articles says writes the words divergent validity. Now, does that mean that do you have to use the words construct validity or divergent validity to talk about construct validity and divergent validity? No, it certainly could be that some studies presented evidence of construct validity without writing the words construct validity. But it's also the case that just because an article used those 2 words together, construct validity, doesn't mean that they necessarily presented evidence for construct validity of their measures or instruments. Okay, and so just what I'm trying to do, I know that this is a little bit of a noisy measure, but I'm trying to just show or exemplify the use of these kind of corpus-based tools for automatic data extraction as a means to conduct, in this case, a kind of methodological synthesis, but a type of meta-research. Another would be, something like extracting effect sizes or other statistics from a body of primary studies, again, in a kind of meta-analytic sample as corpus approach. So recently there's a PhD student here at Northern Arizona University, and we have a sample that Mary Ekberry, and she wrote a Python script, and the idea was to extract every instance of R squared, and that could be written out as R followed by 2, could be written out as R dash squared, R space squared, different combinations of this. And then we're looking at trying to understand or generate a kind of distribution of R squared values to better understand what is sort of typical in second language research or in this applied linguistics research corpus. We did this similarly with eta squared values, and this is a subset of that corpus as well, not the whole sample. And the Python script for this one was written by Kate Yaw at University of South Florida, and we simply she wrote the Python script, and then we ran it through the corpus, and each of these blue balls represents a different eta squared value. So we try to we're looking at what's the distribution of eta squared values in second language research. And we can see that typical, eta squared value when we aggregate these across the studies, median around 0.23, 25th percentile about 0.12, 75th percentile close to 0.4. And by the way, these show that Cohen's benchmarks for eta squared values vastly underestimate what we find in our own field. And so that I find that this is empirical evidence that those kinds of benchmarks are totally not appropriate for our domain. Another type of sort of design method issue is, and I'll just say a couple words about this, is thinking about and using what we might call common sense effect sizes. Should we want meta-analytic findings to be available for everyone? I hope so. I mean, I don't want, like I mentioned meta-analysis before as a kind of efficiency strategy. But if people view the research or the statistics of it as intimidating or not accessible, and I'm talking about researchers, even researchers, but also teachers, teacher trainers, administrators, test developers, curriculum and materials developers, if we can't make our findings accessible to those audiences, then um, we're not behaving efficiently, and maybe we're even in some cases behaving unethically by not contributing to practical domains where we can contribute. And so I just want to mention and kind of suggest, I think this is an area where we as a field, there's been a couple of studies in our field which have started to try to talk about common sense effect sizes, but very, very little. And so I'd encourage us as a domain to start to think about integrate some of these more common sense effect sizes. And this is just an example. I won't really go through it, but our study actually looked at the perceived informativeness of 5 different common sense effect sizes among teachers. And then they looked at the how different teachers perceived the different informativeness of these different common sense effect sizes. So something for our discipline to consider. And I think this also would make a great replication study for our field if anybody wants to kind of get into that, to look at alternatives, because, you know, correlation coefficients and d-values, if we're interested in statistics, and many of us are, then they're super intuitive and they're easy to interpret and things like that. They're standardized. But think about a language teacher or a principal, an administrator. Are they thinking in terms of standardized mean differences? I don't think so. So what can we do to make our research more accessible conceptually to those audiences? That's what the idea behind the common sense effect sizes. Another one here is open science and meta-analysis, which is a topic we've been talking about a lot over the last few years. There is some evidence of movement towards open science practices. This is a search in the IRIS database for meta-analysis. There are 238 records of meta-analysis in the IRIS database. Another good example here, my good friend and collaborator Atsushi Mizumoto provided tools for running meta-analysis on his online Shiny app, langtest.jp. Reza Nourouzian, another longtime friend and collaborator, has provided a number of different packages and sample data and code that he makes available for other scholars to use. So this is open science in action, right? Sharing of code and data, instrumentation. And then we also see examples of, again, people kind of taking meta-analytic findings and trying to make them more accessible and more available to non-academic audiences, which is another angle of open science. So within the OASIS summaries, which are accessible non-technical summaries of primary research, there are a large number now of OASIS summaries of meta research. And this project here, TESOL Graphics, makes these really, really nice, attractive, very professional looking one-page infographics of all secondary or synthetic research. This is also run by another collaborator, Sin-Wang Chong. There's also evidence that maybe we haven't engaged fully in as much open science. The meta research hasn't as much as it could. So WHO's 24 dissertation study, which again looked at 224 L2 meta-analyses, she assessed, among many other things, quality and transparency in those meta-analyses. And she found that 71% provided their full list of primary studies. I think as part of transparency, any meta-analysis should provide the list of primary studies that are being meta-analyzed. But looking further, only 35% of her sample of 224 studies made the coding scheme available, and only 24% made their full data sets available. And there was just one pre-registered study in the sample. So this is kind of concerning in that these findings, I think, show a limited replicability, limited reproducibility, and it limits our ability as a field to be able to assess potential threats to validity in these different meta-analyses. So something that we as a field still need to work on. Another step, and this is one where, I said there's some things that we're doing already and some things that maybe we could start to do a little bit better. And one thing just for us to consider that I've seen in a couple of other disciplines, I've seen in child language development and in workplace psychology research, what has been called cloud-based and community augmented meta-analysis. And what does that mean? Well, there are people that have provided their entire meta-analytic data sets, not only shared the data sets, but that have built them into kind of shiny apps, if anybody's familiar with those kinds of apps, usually web-based apps for data analysis, which are running R in the background. And they're sort of built in a way that you can sort of update a meta-analysis almost in real time. So imagine there's a meta-analysis on a topic that you care about, and then you conduct a primary study that fits the scope of that meta-analysis. Well, you could imagine add your data directly into an existing, let's say like a Google Sheet, which it could be that or something different, and that the meta-analytic outcome sort of updates in real time. It sounds pretty cool and kind of powerful, right? Because it's not always the case that we have meta-analytic replications available to sort of synthesize existing findings up to date. And so that's something I'll talk about in a little bit as well. Okay, next category of meta-analysis 2.0 is the data analysis. And oh my goodness, there's so many exciting things happening here. I wish we could talk more about these. I'm just going to cover them really quickly and briefly. But I do want to touch on a number of them. Here you can see a list of them. I'm not going to really talk about every single one in any depth, but I do want to mention several of them. So again, looking at Hu's dissertation study, Yu-Hung Hu's dissertation study, which evaluated 224 L2 meta-analyses, she found many problematic and underused, and in some cases misused, analytical techniques in the sample. And I'll just mention a few here. So for example, most studies, and the gray bars represent practices that are far from ideal. So the percentage of practices that didn't appropriately or didn't at all weight the effect sizes, which is a common practice in meta-analysis. Most studies, the vast majority, you can see there in number 3, also did not handle dependent effect sizes appropriately, according to her study. And most studies also did not sufficiently or adequately assess the presence of publication bias. Because there's just a few examples that then we can build on here in meta-analysis 2.0. So another technique one technique that we haven't seen very much of in our field, which surprises me a little bit, but maybe it goes back to unfamiliarity with measurement related issues, is the possibility of correcting for attenuation. So if you've taken a couple courses in assessment, you probably know that psychometric artifacts, so things like range restriction and measurement error, like non-perfect reliability, let's say, can attenuate or reduce or obscure observed effects, or they will reduce, let's say, an observed correlation, right? Any error necessarily at the primary level then filters up to the meta level. So if there's measurement error, which is obscuring or attenuating observed correlations, let's say at a primary study level, that'll also happen necessarily at the meta or secondary level. And by the way, Schmidt and Hunter, who some of you will know, they're two of the original founders of meta-analysis. They said that failure to correct for attenuation is the second worst methodological error in psychology. Strong language, right? With the number one being misuse of null hypothesis significance testing. So what we can do though is we can actually, at the primary level, but also at the secondary or meta-analytic level, we can correct for the attenuation or the reduction of observed effect sizes. Just to show a couple of examples of what that looks like. Actually, the first example by Inlenfeld and Rios does not do this practice, but they at least acknowledge it. So what they said was, there were no range. This is a meta-analysis of the predictive validity of TOEFL scores. So essentially a meta-analysis of the correlation between TOEFL scores and GPA in university. Okay, so which is a kind of a funny area, but I won't get into that right now. They said there were no range restriction corrections made to these data, even though it is very likely that this occurred. This occurred being the range restriction. Due to this, the overall calculated average effect size was likely an underestimation of the true mean effect size. Other examples here of the correlation between vocab knowledge and L2 reading, list limitation and criterion measures. We can see the uncorrected values. Then when we correct for the attenuation due to measurement error, due to range restriction, end up being closer. So we're kind of approximating what would be from like a classical test theory perspective, what would be the correlation if we were able to pull out the measurement error or the range restriction, these psychometric artifacts in the observed correlations. So it's pretty cool and pretty powerful. I think that a lot of people would be interested in this. I just think there isn't a lot of familiarity with this technique. Multi-level and mixed effects meta-analysis, meta-regression. Please check out Nourouzian and Bui, just out in 2024 in SSLA. We talk about complex designs and many of the different reasons we want to analyze our data to account for those complex designs. Primary studies, well, why do I want to overcomplicate things here by multi-level and mixed effects and oh my goodness? But we have to recognize that our data are full of data dependencies, and there are reasons why we have to analyze the data appropriately. We often have multiple groups nested within schools and sites and labs. We conduct within and between groups contrasts. We collect data at multiple time points of multiple constructs with multiple correlated measures of each construct. My goodness. This recent meta-analysis, Sun et al., had a sample of 76 studies, but 567 effect sizes. There are many, many data dependencies there, and our analyses in a meta-analysis have to account for the nested nature or structure of our data. Okay, it's also the case that the moderators that we care about, the predictors, are often correlated as well, so necessitating the use of multiple meta-regression type analyses. Meta-SEM, oh my goodness, is like, meta-analysis sounds complicated, which it's not, and SEM sounds complicated, which it is, but we want to combine these. Like, how can we possibly do that? And please check out a paper out in Research Methods in Applied Linguistics a couple of years ago where we kind of introduced that. I'm not going to say much about this, but why do we have to overcomplicate things? Well, our meta-analyses need to, again, reflect our theoretical model. So here just have an example of what these authors did was they took the pooled correlation matrix from the primary studies. Each of these is a meta-analytic correlation, and we're able to build, based on the hypothesized model, a structural equation model of that set of relationships. Same thing here. And this is a paper just out in SSLA, also taking that pooled correlation matrix and using that to build the meta-analytic structural equation model. Final set of meta-analysis 2.0 techniques. And this is actually moving us into new types, in some cases new, in some cases just different types of synthetic secondary meta-analytic research. Okay, so not just meta-analysis. And there's been so many interesting different developments in secondary research in the last few years. I'm just going to mention a few of them, and in the hopes that maybe one of these speaks to you in some way and that you might want to employ it in a domain that you care about. So here's the list here. I don't think I'm going to go through all of these, but most of these I'll say something about. And then again, the references, and again, I'm happy to send out references to anybody who's interested. So meta-analytic replication. What are some good reasons to replicate at the meta-analytic level? There are several good reasons. As new studies come out, we can replicate to have greater power, greater precision of the effect of relationship overall, and the estimate of variance around that effect. By replicating at the meta-analytic level, we can look at changes over time, both in the effects that we observe and or the methods within that particular domain. Using meta-analytic replication, we can address broader or maybe narrower questions. We can add additional moderators if they were maybe not included in the initial meta-analysis. And then we can, of course, improve on the initial meta-analytic methods. So I imagine there's a lot of situations where the paper I mentioned by Nourouzian and Bui, just out, talking about complex designs, these designs that we care so much in L2 research, where there are many different measurement time points and many assessments and correlated measures and correlated groups and all these types of things. Some people may want to take an existing meta-analytic data set and reanalyze it based on some of the techniques that they propose in that paper. Here's an example of actually a series of meta-analytic replications. Plonsky and McKay, 2019, were interested in TBLT, task-based language teaching program effectiveness. And they had a sample of 27 primary studies, overall d-value or standardized mean difference of about 0.9. Boers et al. Looked at that, and they sort of reevaluated the inclusion and exclusion criteria and some of the operational definitions of that sample. They said, actually, we think that according to the true definition of TBLT program, there should have only been, excuse me, 3 studies that actually really meet the definitions that are definitions of TBLT. And when we use just those 3 studies in the sample, we have an overall meta-analytic effect, a standardized mean difference of 0.26. Quan et al. Then 2022 actually reconsidered Boers et al. And I think added some more studies to that sample and came up with a sample of 16 primary studies and a d-value of 0.61. Okay, so sort of an interesting path or trajectory here of different studies replicating each other's findings. Another type of secondary research, reliability, generalization, meta-analysis. And that's a big, long title, and all that really refers to, Vahid, I know you've been involved in a number of these types of studies, and this essentially refers to meta-analyzing reliability coefficients. So to the question of what is the average or typical instrument reliability, like Cronbach's alpha in individual differences research like on anxiety, motivation, willingness to communicate, those types of things. Each of these bars represents a different reliability generalization meta-analysis for a different individual difference variable. And so we see the median typically. So what is reliability typically in L2 individual differences research? Typically around 0.8. Now that's not that bad, but I would add that this reliability, of course, does not ensure validity. Reliability is a prerequisite of validity, but is not validity in itself. Reliability does not equal unidimensionality, something that a lot of these studies don't necessarily consider. The assumptions of alpha, most of the time, these are meta-analyses of alpha coefficients and Cronbach's alpha. And the assumptions of alpha are often violated in the primary studies. So that's something else to think about. And there are some interesting papers out there talking about alternatives to alpha, like McDonald's omega. These correlation or these reliability coefficients are rarely interpreted. Most primary studies and even meta-analyses, if they do this, simply report reliability coefficients without actually doing much with it. And even rarer than that are those corrections to attenuation, which I was talking about before, which are almost never done at the primary level and also rarely at the meta-analytic level. And I think that that's a technique that we certainly could begin to apply. Bibliometric, and almost done here, bibliometric and scientometric reviews. This is a very interesting, fascinating type of meta research that helps us get a new angle on what we are doing in different domains. This is just a line graph to represent the growth of bibliometric analyses over time. These are studies where we look at things like co-authorship patterns, citation patterns, co-citation patterns, impact factors, the backgrounds of different reviewers, editors, authors, publication patterns that come out of different programs or countries or fields, different types of data that are looked at. There's one that I'm involved in right now looking at self-citation patterns. And we're looking at the extent to which applied linguists self-cite. So what is typical self-citation? Sort of veering into the world of research ethics a little bit as well. Okay, so this is another one. There was a special issue out in 2023 in the journal Studies in Second Language Learning and Teaching, specifically on this topic of bibliometric analysis. And then I believe the final one of these non-meta-analytic techniques that I'll mention here is methodological synthesis. And this has been a topic or a procedure, a technique that I have applied now a number of different times. I find it to be very insightful. It leads to lots of insights in a particular domain. So I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons I love meta-analysis is that it provides us with the ability to make empirically grounded recommendations for future research. So we actually know the extent to which we have engaged in a particular domain in certain practices. We know we can assess the quality at the meta-analytic level as a way to inform future research. And so we've done this now across a number of different substantive domains as well as across different methodological practices. So for one example, and it's good for sort of for many things, but for taking a claim about a particular technique and saying, so people claim we engage in second language research in lots and lots of convenience sampling. So Ortega said, most of what we know pertains mostly to formal learning by highly literate adolescents and adults in schools and universities. is that really the case? Well, we can using a methodological synthesis approach, we can actually assess the veracity of that claim. And it turns out that that very much is the case. De Keyser also said almost every sample has been one of convenience. Well, sure enough, in this particular, in Sudina's methodological synthesis of anxiety and motivation research, 83% of the sample used, of the primary studies used convenience sampling. What about going back to validity evidence, right? So I showed kind of the corpus-based approach of assessing validity evidence. Yekaterina Sudina has also done several methodological syntheses looking at, among many other things, scale and study quality in the context of individual difference variables like anxiety, willingness to communicate, motivation. And one of the things she looked at was validity evidence in those primary studies. And she found very, very scant evidence in terms of measurement invariance, convergent validity, divergent validity, sort of in some ways, paralleling what I was showing before, but even in these areas, very few studies showing these different facets of validity to build the validity arguments for their scales, which of course is necessary when we're looking at measuring latent variables or anything. Another just quick example, assumptions reporting practices. So Yuhang Hu and I also looked at the extent to which the assumptions were checked for different types of statistical analyses, and we found overall very low evidence of checking of statistical assumptions. So people might say, well, we need to check more assumptions. Well, to what extent is that actually a problem? Well, we're showing the evidence of the extent to which we actually check and meet statistical assumptions. Last bit here is field-specific assessments and guidelines of and second order reviews. Okay, so we're getting like super meta here. We're like meta the meta, okay? And I'll just say there's been a few of these. I mentioned them earlier before. I'm not going to go through these results here, but this is from Chalmers et al., who looked at 307 meta-analyses in the field of language education using the PRISMA guidelines, which is a set of guidelines for conducting meta-analysis, and found very mixed quality in terms of both methodological rigor and transparency. And same thing with Hu's meta-analysis, who I've mentioned, as well as Wogan and Lee's synthesis or assessment of meta-analytic quality in second language research. So with that, I just will conclude very briefly by saying that, again, I don't want to paint a dark picture. Meta-analysis is powerful and leads to many useful insights, both substantive and methodological in nature. Again, it's changed by diving into the meta-analytic mindset and thinking, the synthetic ethic, as Norris and Ortega referred to it in 2006. It's certainly changed my thinking in many ways. However, just like primary studies, there are many threats to the validity of meta-analyses and meta-analytic outcomes. We need to adhere to empirically grounded and field-specific standards and guidelines for conducting meta research. And for this reason, the full potential of meta-analytic techniques to inform the language sciences, I don't think is fully realized. We've come a long way, but I don't think we're quite there. And so I think what we need to fully embrace meta-analysis 2.0. Okay. And so with that, I will stop. And if anybody has questions or comments, I'd love to hear it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Luke. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to you. I was very excited. I understand that we were talking about 45 minutes. I didn't want to interrupt you at all. I'm very happy that you presented all your slides and your wonderful thoughts with us. Thank you so much for that. And would it be okay if we stopped sharing the slides so our audience can see you when I will ask the questions? And luckily we have received quite a few questions there, and I have lots of questions. I'm not sure if I will find time to ask all of them. Okay, so Luke, thank you again. I wanted to start off by asking you about moderator analysis, and I see that one of the audiences has also asked about moderator analysis. Can we problematize it a little bit more? I was wondering if you could please tell us how moderator analysis can help us understand the status of some field of research in the field. What can we learn exactly from moderator analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like I said before, the moderator analysis is a fundamental part of any meta-analysis. And to me, that's where the most interesting findings. I don't know how you feel about this, Vahid, but as a meta-analyst yourself, but I think that's where the most interesting results come out. We look at, we calculate generally this, we aggregate all these effect sizes together using some kind of model, and that gives us this overall meta-analytic outcome. But then, and we get an estimate of the variance around it. But then the interesting part comes when we start to look at how and if and how we can explain systematic variability in that overall observed effect. So does that overall meta-analytic effect size vary as a function of, right, context or learner background or target feature? And so we start to use it. And we can think of it, another way to think of it, which I think is maybe a little bit more intuitive, is subgroup analysis. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll make subgroups. So the overall meta-analysis, let's say, has 50 studies, and then we'll take the effect sizes from all the ones that were carried out in a second language environment and all the ones that were carried out in a foreign language environment, and we'll compare the effect size in those two, for example, or we'll compare the studies based on high proficiency learners or low proficiency learners. Of course, we can also look at continuous moderators or continuous. We might. I think maybe it's helpful for us to start to think of these as predictors, because sort of moving towards kind of a more of a meta regression approach. What about things like age and length of a treatment or an intervention as predictors of meta-analytic outcomes? So we can also do analyses based on continuous data like correlations and meta regression.
Fantastic, thank you. So in other words, we can break down the variance that we observe in R-squared values, for example, in this context, and see what really is causing the variance in this data. Yeah. And make our understandings and the insight that we get from the data more precise.
Explaining variance. I mean, that's what it's all about, is trying to explain variance in a primary study, many cases, but also at the secondary level.
Fantastic. Okay, you mentioned the application of AI, Python, machine learning. That was a very exciting observation that you have made. So in terms of the future of the field, with the AI emerging, generative artificial intelligence starting to having an impact on different fields of research, what do you think about the future of our field of language or the language studies in general, and also the sustainability of the so-called traditional approaches that we have been using in our field in the age of AI and digital technologies?
I know that there's so much that I don't know. I mean, I've only begun to start to think about it. From a meta-analytic perspective, I'll just say I think that these tools, there's two instances initially that I think are relevant. One, the sorting of primary studies, and two, possibly data extraction techniques. But I can imagine a situation where we could start to use AI perhaps to start to write better search terms. So like a better set of Boolean operators. So a lot of times when we do a meta-analysis and we're using like library databases, for example, we end up getting ourselves in a big mess because we're not consistent, or we can't come up with the right set of search terms to achieve to find the studies to get the positive hits. So one direction we might take this would be to work with AI type software to try out and see what types of strings of searches give us the hits that we actually want. So that would be just one example. But I don't know, do you have any ideas on this, Vahid? I mean, you're very active in this area as well. I wonder what you think.
Well, yeah, I think it would give us better opportunities. It would make our analysis probably more efficient. But I'm also thinking that, for example, our graduate courses, our graduate programs should start thinking about making some tweaks and changes in the age of AI and machine learning. And we probably should start thinking more within the framework of interdisciplinary research and integrate interdisciplinary thinking in the age of AI. In a paper in language testing, I echoed Paul Garuba, who said that language assessment, the way as we know it, will cease to exist in a generation. It may sound like a radical prediction, but I think in the age of AI, we need to think about the sustainability of the methods that we're actually using. Otherwise, at some point we may encounter survival issues as as a field. I don't know what you feel about that, but to some people it sounds a bit a radical sort of prediction. To some people it sounds like a more reasonable way of thinking.
Realistic. Yeah.
Realistic.
I know that that's happening a lot in the world of assessment already. I've seen a number of instances. Talking recently with a language testing friend of mine, I know that they're using that very actively. So yeah, lots of different uses. But I like what you said. Also thinking about the curriculum and sort of running graduate programs, that has to be part of it. I do have a colleague here at Northern Arizona University, Jesse Egbert, who has been teaching a course on Python for years, and so for linguistic analysis. But and that seems like it's a very popular class, and I'm really glad that we have that here in the program.
Fantastic. Okay, let's circle back to meta-analyses, Luke. There's another question about moderator analysis. One of the audiences is asking, what if we run a moderator analysis and we find that the moderator was not significant? What does that imply about that moderator and our meta-analysis?
Good question. Well, first, I'd say all of our moderator analyses, just like any analysis that we run in a primary study, like an independent variable, any independent variable we're going to include in a model at the primary level, should have a theoretical and or practical rationale. So we don't want to this isn't just like kitchen sink, what I call kitchen, just throw all the variables in and see what comes out. We don't want to do that kind of research really ever. And when we do doing something like that, we need to be clear about what's exploratory and what's confirmatory, first of all. When we run a moderator analysis, though, and we don't, let's call it a subgroup analysis, we're comparing effect sizes from two subgroups of the meta-analytic sample, there's no statistically significant difference. That's fine. I mean, to me, if you had any analysis that we run, if you have a good theoretical rationale for running that analysis, for including that predictor or independent variable, and you think you have good measurement of that construct, because that also matters too. There's measurement error in the meta-analytic coding as well. So we have error there. But if you have a good tool and a good rationale for running the study, that's an interesting finding no matter what. I don't care that there's no difference. And in some cases that can be just as interesting or more informative than showing that there is a difference. So I would say still report it.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, of course, there's still insight into what you have discovered, even if the moderator doesn't affect or doesn't predict the variance that you see in your data. Fantastic. Yeah. Another question, Luke, is about AI tools. Someone is asking, Shelley, I'm going to read the name of the questionnaires. Shelley is asking, I was wondering whether there are any AI tools available that can help us detect errors in meta-analysis or other types of synthetic studies. You basically talked about that, and I was wondering if there are any tools
for detecting errors. I don't know of any. They may exist. I have seen tools, I don't know if they're AI based, but they do run some automatic analyses to detect what's called kind of p-hacking, if anybody's familiar with that, in primary studies. So you have a sample of primary studies and a tool that will try to detect evidence of questionable statistical analyses, things like that. But I don't know about it in the meta-analytic context. But very interesting. I'd be curious to see if anybody finds something. But there are interesting things coming out all the time. I would recommend, if anybody is like really interested in synthetic methods, there's actually a journal devoted to it called Research Synthesis Methods. It's published by Wiley, and a lot of it's open access, not the whole journal. But if you want to find out what people are talking about in terms of synthetic methods, check out that journal.
Fantastic. Research Synthetic Methods. Good. Quickly go to the next question, Luke, by Ali Souf. He's asking about the differences between robust Bayesian meta-analysis and Bayesian meta-analysis, and how I can run a robust subgroup Bayesian meta-analysis in the software JASP.
Ooh, okay, nice. I wonder if I don't have experience with that, with robust or Bayesian meta-analysis. There's only a few people in the field who have. Vahid, I don't know if you do, or I know that Reza Nourouzian, who I believe I saw here earlier, does have experience with Bayesian meta-analysis. He has one coming out with Xiandi Liu and Dan Brown coming out, I believe, in language teaching research, coming out fairly soon. But I don't. Do you have any experience with that, Vahid?
My understanding is when you use robust methods of parameter estimation, we basically are trying to control for the impact of outliers and heterogeneous samples. I suppose I don't know. I don't have much experience in this field as well, but I suppose that robustness in the case of Bayesian meta-analysis also refers to the same thing. We want to control for the effect of outliers and deviations or digressions from normality, as far as I understand. But that's a great question. Thank you, Ali, for asking that. All right, so I'm going to move to the next question, Luke.
Yep.
So here is by Huijun, who is asking, I was wondering whether there is any pedagogical implications of meta-analysis for practitioners like language teachers.
Hopefully. Yeah. In many cases, I mean, the meta-analyses that address topics that are relevant to language teachers, I think they all should. So things like, this example might be more of policy, but there was a meta-analysis of age effects. And it was found that in foreign language environments, it has an effect, age does have a strong effect, whereas in second language environment, it doesn't have as much of an effect, or vice versa. But that's sort of a language policy issue in terms of length of instruction or amount of instruction, or when and how much time to spend on more complex grammatical features versus simpler grammatical features. These are all questions that have come out of L2 meta-analyses that have, I think, direct implications for the L2 classroom. And so that's, again, another instance when it's useful to dive into those moderators, because that's when you see those, I think that's when you find those results that are most pertinent to a particular context. You can actually pinpoint where in the meta-analysis are the effects that actually pertain to your context. So intermediate, or beginner, advanced, intermediate, or elementary versus high school versus university. Oftentimes those are used as moderators for meta-analytic outcomes. You can say, so this is actually where these results are most pertinent to my context. And even in cases where people provide their meta-analytic data set, if somebody felt so inclined, you could even go back in and calculate moderators that the authors didn't even conduct for their own study to identify the meta-analytic outcome for your, for your proficiency level, for your context, for your setting, for your target features that you care about. So that's another call for, sharing our meta-analytic data sets so people can reanalyze them.
Fantastic. Yeah, I like the way that you also tied the idea of moderator analysis and its influence on, or its potential contribution to teaching methods and learning methodologies in second language learning. Fantastic. Another question is by Rita here. She's asking, could we get the citation for Chalmers et al. 2023? I don't see it in an online bibliography.
Yes, Rita, I'm sorry about that. I need to add that to my bibliography, and I will send that to you personally in just a few minutes.
Okay, great. The next question by Fuang. She's asking, could you recommend ways we can mitigate the issue of publication bias when conducting meta-analysis studies?
Yeah, so you could almost think of it like a sensitivity analysis or even a type of moderator analysis. There are things you could think of it that way, but the idea is to simply try to estimate the presence of bias in your sample. And there's lots of different tools and techniques for doing that. Sometimes we try to plot an estimate of variance by the effect size, and we look for sort of gaps in distribution. And I can point you towards readings on this if you want to get into it. Sometimes we try to say, well, where are the gaps in the distribution, and what would happen to the estimate if we added in a few studies over here? Let's say the smaller effects are missing. We think that they're missing from what would be a normal distribution of effects. Well, if we added those in, what would be our adjusted overall estimate of the meta-analytic correlation or mean difference or whatever? So there are certainly ways of doing this. But one of the things that I want to emphasize again that's super important, those are sort of after the fact, but one of the best ways that we can try to mitigate the effect of publication bias in our meta-analytic sample is by conducting very, very thorough searches. And so that those, and when I'm involved in meta-analysis, I'm not just searching, a couple library databases and maybe Google Scholar. There's maybe 20 different search channels or techniques that I try to engage in, including regular Google. And why do I say regular Google as opposed to, I do, of course, Google Scholar, but regular Google will get you the conference papers, the technical reports, the papers that are just on somebody's website, all these other sort of what we call the gray literature that we're not going to get necessarily through the library databases. So really, really thorough searches, and then assessing, listservs, things like that, and then assessing the potential presence of publication bias using some of those different techniques. And there's plenty of off-the-shelf kind of software for doing that at whatever stats software you're comfortable with.
Fantastic. And let me just add a follow-up question about the question of bias here, because I think it's an important question. I was wondering, Luke, if you know of any methods, or if you have used any methods which can differentiate between the type of bias that is attributed to the bias of us as meta-analysts versus the bias that is natural and is in the field, in for example, in the published studies with good R-squared values.
I love that question. That's really fun to think about. Yes, I mean, yeah, there have actually been, this won't surprise you, Vahid, but others may be unfamiliar. There are studies that look at bias among meta-analysts. So I'm thinking of one from a few years ago. Some meta-analysts have very conveniently sort of thrown out primary studies based on the fact that they didn't line up with that particular researcher's point of view on the variables in question. How could we, well, at the meta level, we can assess that. But one thing to do might be to disclose this kind of thing. Like if your lab happens to be interested in a particular, like how some labs or some scholars have like their pet variable, and like they're always pushing for this one variable. If that's the case, maybe try to be upfront about that, and maybe take extra care if you're going to run a meta-analysis that has that variable in it, or where that variable figures prominently, and have maybe try and build in some safeguards to the coding process to make sure that you're creating that sort of arm's length distance. Do you have any ideas on this?
Fantastic. Not really. I'm just learning from you, really. But this is a question that I've been thinking about, and I didn't find many studies on this. But your ideas are really helpful here. Fascinating. Another question is by another Rita. I wonder, how do we evaluate the trustworthiness of the aggregated effect of a meta-analysis if publication bias is found in this field of literature, as the rest could have already been inflated and missing of non-significant results? That's an interesting question. Again, about bias.
It certainly happens. It certainly happens. I mean, I would say, I would almost just go into, when you look at meta-analytic outcomes, because of the bias to statistical significance in our field and many others, I would almost just assume every meta-analysis is really an overestimate of the true population relationship. I know that maybe sounds dramatic, but that seems to be, I think there's good evidence to believe that's the case. And actually, Yuhong Hu, who's here, she and I, who I mentioned her assessment of L2 meta-analyses in my talk a couple of times, she and I actually have a paper we presented a couple of years ago at ELL, an initial version of it, where we looked at all the L2 meta-analyses that did look at publication status as a moderator. So what is the difference in effect sizes between published and unpublished studies? And we sort of meta-analyzed those differences to try to kind of quantify or estimate the effect of publication bias in the field. But even that won't truly reflect the full difference between all the studies that they never made it into any of those samples, because whoever did the study just buried it, and it never even made it as a conference talk or as a technical report or something like that. So I don't know, there are tools for estimating it, but it's an imperfect science, I have to admit.
Fantastic. Good. So we will remain ignorant about those studies that have never been published, unfortunately. And the sad thing about that is that they may have very, very useful knowledge in them, but for some reason, since they do not get published, we may just miss that knowledge.
It's true, and I think that what we need, actually, the real source of this disease is our obsession with statistical significance. If we would just move away from that and get more towards estimation thinking, then this would be less of an issue. It would still be an issue because people want to report larger effects in their studies, but it wouldn't be this arbitrary, flawed cutoff of 0.05, and the way that's just, that's limited us so much as a field, across the social and natural sciences, really. But that's the true root of many of these problems.
True. Great. Another question from Jion. She's asking, my question is about leveraging knowledge gained from meta-analyses to identify gaps for primary research. Sometimes I see that moderator effects reported in meta-analyses have never directly compared in primary studies. What would you say about support for this kind of primary research?
I love that. Yeah, so that is one really cool thing about meta-analysis. And just in case that wasn't clear for anybody, you can actually conduct moderated analysis on a relationship that no single primary study ever assessed. So just let me give an example. You have a whole bunch of primary studies. Like I'll use the example of second language context versus foreign language context. No primary study might have actually collected data in a second language and a foreign language environment, but you can use that moderator at the meta level. Really cool. But that's a great, so that kind of finding would be useful to argue for the need for those primary studies. And there may be, that kind of analysis, you could say it's problematic because it could be that those two populations are totally different and we shouldn't really compare them in that way. That there's other inherent differences between those settings or populations that make them not appropriate to compare. But anyway, yeah, you can do that.
Right. Yeah, in other words, there's always room for innovation and further research, right? There is a theory of knowledge. I don't know how relevant it is, but it just popped up in my mind. I'd like to share it very quickly in the interest of time. It simply says that we have knowledge about things around us, about the phenomenon around us, generally speaking. But the more we learn about it, the more ignorant we become, because we then start to learn about our ignorance about those things. So it's always good to know what we are ignorant about and start researching our ignorance to perhaps learn a little bit about them and find more about the areas that we are not ignorant about. Because it's okay to be ignorant, but it's not okay to be ignorant about our ignorance.
Yeah, that's almost like a definition of wisdom, is to recognize the things that you don't know. And that is one thing where, this is relevant to maybe the broader discussion of this series. The more I learn about quantitative methods, Vahid, I don't know about you, but the more I learn, the more I just realize what I don't know, which is kind of scary, but I enjoy it all the same.
Yeah, precisely the same here, exactly. So the next question is by Johan. I wonder how we could conduct the publication bias detection for meta-analysis using a multi-level model, for example, a 3-level meta-analysis. It's a bit technical here.
Yeah, but seems certainly possible. You can include publication status as one of the first or second level in the model. Sure. Trying to think how else you do that. Do you have any ideas on that?
By the way, Ruzian has been helping answering these questions. So I just saw that he has left a link there. So I believe that Johan and anyone else who's interested, in addition to what Luke said, you can also look at that link.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Great, nice. So Stella, by the way, Luke, I know that this is getting late for you. It's your dinner time.
I'm fine. No, don't worry about me. I'm having meta-analysis for dinner. So yeah, that's
all right. Fantastic. So please, whenever you think it's just getting too late for you, just let me know. I really don't want to.
We're almost through the questions.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So another one is I'm from liberal arts. It's from Stella. I'm from liberal arts background, and have limited knowledge in writing program scripts. So I'm using CMA and off-the-shelf software for meta-analysis, which is pretty fine. However, it doesn't work very well with effect sizes like coefficient beta. What's your advice for researchers with liberal arts backgrounds or any backgrounds like that using software like CMA?
Yeah, comprehensive meta-analysis, I think, is the one that she's using. I don't know about, well, maybe a more fundamental question to think about first is whether or not it's appropriate to run meta-analysis on beta coefficients. I don't know if that's really the case. I think that might only be the case, Stella, if all the primary studies in your sample had the same set of predictors using the same measures. So other than that situation, I don't know if you'd want to use beta as your kind of dependent variable for the meta-analysis. Other than that, though, I would say there are also some other, JASP is another great example of, so if you can address that problem, you know, then okay, then I'd say move on to the next question, your actual question. I would say check out JASP as a alternative. JASP is a really nice, free, off-the-shelf, point and click, very user-friendly software that includes extensions or tools for running meta-analysis. So I don't know if anybody else here has experience with that, but I think it works great, and I'd highly recommend it. CMA also, as you know, Stella, does cost, and but JASP is free, and so I'd recommend checking that out. Jamovi is similar, and I don't know for sure. I've never used Jamovi for meta-analysis, but I'm pretty sure it may have meta-analysis functionality as well.
Yeah, JASP and Jamovi are two great and free software packages out there. They're basically running on R. R is like under the hood, working under the hood, and you have a jacket, like a user-friendly interface. You can just click and go. We moved on from SPSS at our, you know, in the courses that I am teaching, because SPSS was a bit not a bit, actually was really expensive. Not that it's not a good software, it's fantastic. So we have moved on to Jamovi now, where we're using Jamovi for multivariate analysis. All right, so another question is from Reza, and this is the last question in the chat box here. I was wondering if meta-analysis should be done with when the primary studies have found mixed results, or meta-analysis can be done in other cases as well. Great question.
Good question. Reza, make me think for a second. The easy answer is yes, but then I thought maybe no. But I think yes, because the mixed results, I was going to say mixed effects. The mixed results are simply, to me, an opportunity to dive into, find the interesting moderators and explain the spread in scores. So I would say for sure can be done and probably should be done. It might be, if they're very mixed, because also the mixed results is gonna, you know, you may get a lot of error around your estimate, and that's okay too. It's not a bad thing. It's just a sign that maybe there are moderators in there that you need to then, you're actually maybe you're talking about multiple populations, would be another way to think of it. Vahid, Reza and I go way back, and so these are it's a question I don't think we've ever talked about. Vahid, do you have any thoughts on that?
Fantastic. I just wanted to add on that, or perhaps just really echo what you said, Luke. I think before doing a meta-analysis, I myself do not usually have an idea whether the results are going to be significant, generally speaking, or not. So it's just from a philosophical perspective, is an attempt for me to answer some of my pressing questions in doing that analysis, hoping that finding an answer for them will also offer some insights to the field and to the people who are also, you know, investigating similar research questions.
Yeah, it might be that you have an estimate with a confidence interval that's, you know, massive around that estimate, and that's not a bad thing. It's not ideal from a researcher's. It's not ideal because we want to know we have an estimate and that estimate is very close to some population mean. But if the reality is that there's a lot of variability around that mean, that's just the reality of the data that we're working with, and then maybe we need to think about additional moderators or subpopulations that are in there. I like that response.
Fantastic. I have two more questions, Luke, before we finish the seminar today. One of them is about pre-registered studies. It's a fantastic, I believe it's a fantastic thing to do, to pre-register your study. But I just realized that, I mean, I looked at the statistics you presented, and actually resonates with what we are looking at in the field of language assessment. My question is, what are the benefits of pre-registering your studies? That's one. And also, what are the challenges of doing a pre-registered study and just registering it? Do we have difficulty publishing the actual study later in some way?
I don't think that to the second question, the challenges, I don't think that there would be any additional problems later on. The only one I could think of would be that if a reviewer, for example, or editor felt that you deviated too much from your original plan, which is allowable. You just have to annotate which techniques or moderators, let's say, you coded for and analyzed that weren't in your initial plan. That would be maybe a challenge or a downside. But the benefit would be that you're sort of saying up front, these are the moderators I'm going to look at. These are the predictors of the relationship that I think matter, and that it would be, as a reader, I would probably have a little more confidence in the meta-analytic outcome, that they didn't, maybe they coded for 60 potential moderators, but they only included 7 in the final report. They only and they're all significant, or they're all, they all contribute they're all associated strongly with the outcome variable or something. So you buy yourself more credibility, I think, with the audience by saying, here's what I ended up doing, or here's what I said I'm going to do, and here's what I did. The other advantage I think you'd get from pre-registering would be that you could get feedback on your protocol or your coding scheme. So, like, you're an expert in a number of areas, and everybody here is an expert in the areas that they know and study. But there are things that we just can't. I might make a coding scheme, and I might give it to another expert and somebody who cares about the same things I do, and they might see things differently. They might come up with new variables or different levels of measurement, and they say, no, you might be better to do it this way. So that would be another advantage of a pre-registration, that you could then get feedback on that protocol or that coding scheme before actually going through all the work of collecting the data.
Fantastic, thanks. And my own last question is, I don't see any other questions in the chat box. So my last question is about the fascinating topic you discussed about the attenuation, the controlling for the attenuation. For example, when there is low reliability in the data, there is a high error of measurement, and that high error of measurement can result in type 1 errors, or in some cases type 2 errors and all that. Not within the field of meta-analysis, within primary studies. I was wondering if you have encountered, or if you know of any methods that can help us to control for that attenuation, for example, in reliability, when we are doing some kind of analyses, like multivariate analyses. For example, we're looking at a data that has low reliability, a low Cronbach's alpha of 0.5. And now we want to use that data to decide whether some kind of external variable like gender or whatever, I mean, just using some simple variables here, can have an impact on our target dependent variable. But we also know that reliability is pretty low here. Is there any way to go around this problem, in your opinion?
Oh man, I don't know. You're the psychometrician in the room. So I would probably, I'd ask what you think about that, but there must be ways to do it. There must be ways to do it. One response might be, well, why are you working with a measure with low reliability? But there are some things that are just noisy, and they're impossible to measure without having the noise sort of seep its way in. I really don't know that. I love the question, and I'd like to think about it more in an applied scenario.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Do you have any thoughts on how we could do that? I mean, but I do think at the primary level, and like the SLA literature, I would like to see more accounting for that, adjusting, whether it's actually formally adjusting relationships or observed effects, or just recognizing the measurement error that's present in our data. I just don't see it. You live more in the world of assessment, Vahid, than I do, so you probably see more of that. But I don't see it very much on my side of the street in the SLA literature.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I mean, we encountered this quite a little bit, and I'm always wondering what is the implication of this. Of course, we know that the one potential implication is that it's going to affect the effect sizes that we estimate. Sure. It can attenuate it, as the name implies. And I'm always wondering, I'm really bothered by this observation. I'm wondering how we can take away the effect of these errors of measurement and just stick with the actual variance that is contributed by the construct that's under assessment. Some people have suggested structural equation modeling to separate them, but we don't always have the luxury of doing structural equation modelings with the very small sample sizes that we get in our field, right?
Right.
I'm not really sure about that, but yeah, if anything comes to your mind later, please let me know.
I just at the very least, just recognizing that error is in there, that would be a step for the field. Just recognizing that the error is present. And again, some of the solutions to the problems that we're talking about actually involve kind of going back a few steps. So like in the same way that publication bias issue we have to solve the problem, before, instead of addressing it on the back end, we need to address on the front end, which is deal with our obsession with statistical significance. In the same case here, primary researchers need to spend more time developing, validating their instruments and tools, and part of that is ensuring adequate level of internal consistency, range restriction, limited range restriction, all these types of things like that. So there's sort of like these front end things that practices or techniques that we can engage in that are also really necessary.
Fantastic, thank you.
For example,
that's great advice. Thank you. So I don't think that there are any further questions left here. Raeisi is recommending a software package called PsychMeta R package. Okay, sure. Thank you, Raeisi. I will take a look at that. So I think this should bring us to the end of this seminar today. I wanted to thank you again, Luke. I understand that it's your dinner time. I appreciate that you stayed with us. Although I think I booked your time for 1 hour, you stayed way beyond 1 hour with us. Much appreciated. And also thanks to the audience, and thanks to Lynette for helping us to organize the administration part of our seminar today. One last thing, everybody. I'm going to upload the video later to my YouTube channel. If you're not familiar with it, here is the link to my YouTube channel. And if you have not had a chance to listen carefully to some part of the talk that Luke presented, you can go through the video there. Luke, any last remarks or comments, any suggestions for us before we call it a day?
No, that's all. Just to say thank you so much for the invitation, for everybody for coming out and being here. I know it's weird hours for many people, and I'm always up for talking meta, so I appreciate this opportunity to do so.
Thank you so much again, and thank you everybody, and have a great day. Have a great evening, Luke.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Take care. Goodbye, everyone.